It's time for us to check back in with the thread that runs so true. If you've missed the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. 9 of my 14 pupils came from farms. The sale of farm products was their total earnings. Billy Leonard, who rode the pony 9 miles to school, was the son of a coal miner. Another was the son of a rural teacher who supplemented his salary by farming during the summer. And I had the son and daughter of a deputy county sheriff. He had farmed before he was appointed deputy sheriff. Not one of the parents of my pupils was a college graduate. Not one had ever been to college. Not one was a high school graduate. The rural teacher had only a few credits in high school. The majority of them hadn't finished grade work in the rural schools, but these parents had another kind of education. They knew the soil they farmed, they knew what to plant, where to plant, and when to plant. They knew how to cultivate their land. They had learned these things by experience, and they knew when and how to harvest. While the men worked with the soil and the seasons, their thrifty wives ran their homes. There was some contrast to the homes in Tiber Valley and in Lonesome Valley. The reason for these differences, perhaps, was the soil. The Tiber River soil was better than the Lonesome Valley soil, and the Tiber Valley farmers used newer methods of farming, better machinery, and they cared for their land. This land to them was something like their own flesh and blood. Their forefathers, approximately a century and a half before, had settled in this valley. The same names, same families, same bloodstreams were here. With the passing of the years, the farms had grown smaller. They had been divided by the children when their elders died, divided again and again, until the farms had not great boundaries they once had. Each cliff, forest, stream, and large roadside tree had some affectionate meaning to them. During crop season, if one man got behind with his work, or if he had sickness in his family and couldn't work, his neighbors helped him. It was the same in autumn harvest. The people worked in unison. They helped each other. There were no feuds. They were good neighbors. There were 4 different religious denominations. There was as many churches. Not anyone was particularly interested in what church you attended. That was your business. If you didn't attend a church at all, you weren't criticized. And everybody in the different churches aimed at the same heaven. This was hard for me to believe after my experience at Lonesome Valley, which was less than 30 miles away. Of the 32 voting precincts in Greenwood County, Winston was the only precinct where neither of the 2 major political parties could use money. They didn't even attempt to buy votes at Winston. Each political party could almost count the Winston vote before it was cast. Usually there was a tie vote. At least neither party ever carried the precinct with more than 7 votes. Often the majority either way would be 1 or 2 votes. These people were the parents of the pupils I was teaching in Winston High School. These were the old landlocked Americans for whom Superintendent Larry Anderson had established a high school to give their children more educational opportunities. Their children were willing to take advantage of any opportunities. At the end of my first 2 weeks, I knew I was learning algebra, Latin, and plane geometry. I didn't worry about my pupils. All I worried about was keeping ahead of them. I thought I might ease the situation and not have to work so hard myself if I brought them more books to read. We didn't have a library. We had only a dictionary and an encyclopedia. The books I had brought to read myself, my pupils read in the first 2 weeks, and they were asking for more books. Budge Waters didn't read by sentence. He read by paragraph. That was the reason on the Saturday morning of my 2nd week, I caught the speed wagon for Lansboro. From Lansboro, I walked 5 miles home. I didn't have any way to get back to Winston on Sunday. The speed wagon didn't carry mail on Sunday. I might be lucky enough to catch a ride after I walked from W Hollow to the Sandy River Turnpike. I would have a heavy load of books to carry a long distance, but I didn't mind carrying books to pupils as eager to read as my Winston High School pupils. I didn't know the kind of books to select for these pupils. There was an age level of books recommended for high school freshmen, but I didn't know about it. I filled my suitcase with books I loved, books I thought that would keep them reading for some time. I chose books by Tolstoy, Melville, Chekhov, Victor Hugo, de Maupassant, Balzac, Thomas Hardy, Sinclair Lewis, Emerson, Whittier, Hamlin Garland, Dreiser, Whitman, Poe, Edgar Lee Masters, Bret Harte, and Jack London. With my suitcase full, I followed a fox path across the Seton Ridge to the Sandy River Turnpike, which was 3 miles closer than if I had gone by Lansboro. I walked up the dusty turnpike along the river, then up Raccoon Valley and over the mountain. I walked down into the Hinton Valley and up to the top of the east wall overlooking the Tiber Valley. I put my suitcase down and was resting under the shade of a roadside tree. I had walked about 11 miles with a 40-pound load. I was sweaty and tired. Then a stranger with an Ohio license on his car drove up, stopped, and asked me to ride. He took me all the way to Winston. Monday, I introduced my pupils to these new authors. I told them to take the books, read them, and exchange them until everybody had read them. I told them that they were my books. All I wanted them to do was to take care of them and return them when they were through. Budge Waters selected War and Peace. My getting novels, books of poetry, essays, and short stories didn't keep my pupils from crowding me. How I wished that I had worked harder in high school and college. How I wished that I had learned everything in my assignments. I had thought I would never use this subject matter again. All I hadn't learned, I was having to learn. All I had learned and had tried to forget, I was having to review. And this kept me busy. This was the first time in my life I had ever heard of high school pupils crowding their teacher. It had always been the other way around. This made me wonder if I had been a good forgetter of all I had learned, or if I hadn't learned at all. Since I had only 2 years of Latin and was now trying to teach first-year Latin, I had to spend considerable time on this subject, and by doing this, I neglected to work ahead of my pupils in algebra. One day in the 3rd week, Billy Leonard came to me and said, "Mr. Stewart, will you show me how to work this algebra problem?" I looked at the problem. It was a problem about trains starting at given points and running toward each other so many miles per hour, and how long would it be before they met. I had never solved this problem in my first year algebra. "Billy, I can't work this problem," I laughed, telling him the truth. "Mr. Stewart, I understand," he answered. "You want your pupils to work these problems, don't you?" "Yes, if they can," I said. In less than 30 minutes, Billy Leonard was back with the problem solved. He showed it to me. "Your theory is right, Billy," I said. "You've solved this problem." I knew he was right after I had seen it worked, but Billy Leonard never knew that I couldn't actually work this problem. Often my pupils solved algebra problems before I could. I threw the responsibility of plane geometry, algebra, and Latin directly upon them. I was just a little better pupil in plane geometry and Latin, working along with them. In the subject of algebra, I doubt that I was as good as half the members of my class, but the way we covered algebra and the way my pupils learned it gave me another thought. I wondered if many teachers weren't too good in the subjects they taught, and if they didn't teach over their pupils' heads. This experience made me wonder if it wasn't better when the teacher didn't know his subject too well and had to work with his pupils closer. Then he had more sympathy and understanding. Budge Waters had a strange sense of humor. He never laughed unless one of his classmates made a mistake, and they made mistakes. When he laughed all over. His whole body shook. And when his teacher made a mistake, he would laugh until tears came from his elongated eyes and ran down his pimpled cheeks. He would laugh until all his classmates and his teacher would start laughing at him. His teacher did considerable laughing, too. When I had first come to Winston, I wondered what my pupils did for recreation. I wondered what I would do for recreation. I had thought reading was about the only kind of recreation. It didn't take me long to learn differently. One evening in September, I was invited to Bill Madden's home. He was one of my pupils. His father had invited 6 or 7 of the local musicians in to play for us. We sat in the yard where the grass was dying, and the peach tree leaves had turned golden, and the moon was high in the sky above us. We listened to this local band play with their banjos, fiddles, guitar, mandolin, and accordion from 7 until 11. They never played the same tune twice, and often when they played a fast breakdown, one of the listeners would dance. I had never heard old-time music sound as beautiful as this in the moonlight of the mild September evening. There was hardly a family in this big vicinity who didn't have a musician. This was part of their recreation. People had learned to play musical instruments to furnish their own music, just as they had learned to plant, cultivate, and harvest crops for their food supply. They depended upon themselves for practically everything. I went with my pupils, their parents, and neighbors to corn huskings, apple peelings, bean stringings, square dances, and to the belling of the bride when there was a wedding. Often we rode mules many miles through darkness or moonlight to these community events. I never missed a party at the mill when they made sorghum molasses in this great cane country. We went to the sorghum mill, shoved each other in the skimmins hole, and ate the soft, sweet foam from the boiling cane juice with long paddles whittled from willow wood. I went to all of the churches. I went with my pupils to the churches of their choice. I went to parties where we played post office and where we danced to Skip to My Lou. I didn't worry about recreation. I found plenty of recreation. It was the kind of recreation in which the old, middle-aged, and young took part. There were not a few having fun and a whole crowd around them to watch. This was the most democratic recreation I had ever seen. Not one of my pupils had ever seen a stage play. If one had ever seen a movie, I'd never heard of it. They didn't have to leave landlocked Winston to find recreation. They had it at home. They created it just as they created most of their necessities of life. As the autumn days wore on, they popped corn over the blazing wood fires and made molasses and popcorn balls. There was somewhere to go every night. I couldn't accept all the invitations. Each pupil invited me to his home to spend the night. This was an old custom, for in the past years the teacher had boarded with his pupils since his salary wasn't enough to enable him to pay his board and have anything left. When the hunting season came, I hunted quail with my pupils. I hunted rabbits with them in the Tiber weed fields. My pupils were good marksmen, but I gave them a few surprises at some of the shots I made. I had never told them about my years of hunting experience. I went to the autumn coloring hills to hunt possums, and I taught them, as I had tried to teach them high school subjects, a little about possum hunting, that on the still and misty warm nights when not a leaf stirred was the time to catch possums and coons. When I learned more about the terrain of the east and west walls, where the persimmons and pawpaws grew, I showed them where to find the possums. They, as I had done once, hunted for animal pelts, shipped them, and bought books and clothes with the money. I showed them how to take better care of their pelts. Many nights I climbed with them to the top of the east or west wall with a pack of hounds. Often there were 25 or 30 men with us, and we'd have from 30 to 50 hounds to chase the fox. We'd build a fire on the highest peak of stone or earth and listen to the music of the running hounds. We could hear the music of their barking, for we were high enough to listen to them circle the fox around us. We braved all sorts of weather to listen to the magic barking and running of the hounds. On many a moonlit night, we saw the fox not more than 100 yards ahead of the speckled black, white, brown, and tan hounds as they came pouring from the autumn woods into an open field with their heads high in the air. The fox was hot and left much scent on the wind. The hounds didn't have to put their noses to the earth. They could smell the fox ahead instead of nosing the earth for his track. Then came the autumn rains when the speed wagon no longer made the mail run to Lansboro. The only road that connected the valley with the county seat town was impassable. Anybody wanting to go to Lansboro had to provide his own means of transportation. He had to walk, ride muleback or horseback, or take 2 teams hitched to 1 wagon. For the valley, after the autumn rains, after the freezes and thaws, became a sea of mud. The slender, winding road was a ribbon of mud. I saw loads of tobacco leaving Winston with as many as 3 mule teams hitched to 1 wagon. I never saw a wagon loaded with barrels of sorghum or tobacco have less than 2 mule teams. It took 1 good mule team to pull an empty wagon. The wheels sank in mud to their hubs. Winston was isolated. This is why the people depended upon themselves for everything. When the speedwagon stopped making the run to Landsboro, people knew the long winter months of isolation had begun. The mail was carried by horseback. Wid Maddox put his speedwagon away to use again next May or June, depended on the condition of the roads. The people in Winston knew spring had returned when the speedwagon started hauling mail. Now Wid used from 4 to 6 horses. He rode one and led a pack horse. When the mail was heavy, he'd often lead 2 pack horses. He rode part of the 30-odd mile mail route to where he put these horses in a barn at Midway. There he got fresh horses and continued his journey to Landsboro. He spent the night in Landsboro. Next morning he rode to Midway, where he exchanged his tired horses for fresh ones so he could continue his journey over the ribbon of sloppy mud. When the leaves changed color in the valley and the sun was bright as a brush pile flame, I went on long hikes with my pupils. We'd take a hike to the autumn-colored hills soon as the school day was over. We'd take food to cook over an open fire on the summit of one of the walls that enclosed the valley. Sometimes the girls would go with us. The hike to the high summits was often a strenuous climb. We would see the valley below in its autumn colors while we ate and talked. The Tiber Valley walls grew mostly one type of tree. That was the tough-budded white oak. This tree choked almost all other types of growth on these infertile slopes. It would root well into the hard, bony earth and into the rock crevices, and in autumn, when these leaves colored, they were beautiful to see. On each side of the valley, these leaf clouds rose toward the sky until they reached the pine groves on the wall's crest. These leaf clouds were brilliant when they rippled in the sun. The pine groves made green clouds between the golden leaf clouds and the blue of the sky. Down in the valley, we could see every splash of color. Green leaves were there still, for the Tiber mist had protected them against the biting frost. There were blood-red shoemake leaves, golden sycamore and poplar leaves, slate-colored water birch leaves, and the dull and bright gold willow leaves. And down in the valley, the corn shocks stood like wigwams in an Indian village. We could see the bright knee-high corn stubble glittering in the autumn sun. We could see the brown meadow stubble, too, where the hay had been mown and piled in high mounds with poles through the center. Often I walked along beside the Tiber in autumn, for there was a somberness that put me in a mood that was akin to poetry. I'd watch the big sycamore leaves zigzag from the interlocking branches above to the clear blue Tiber water and drift away like tiny golden ships. I'd find the farewell to summer in bloom along this river. Then a great idea occurred to me. It wasn't about poetry, it was about schools. I thought if every teacher in every school in America, rural, village, city, township, church, public, or private, could inspire his pupils with all the power he had, if he could teach them as they had never been taught before to live, to work, to play, and to share, if he could put ambition into their brains and hearts, that would be a great way to make a generation of the greatest citizenry America had ever had. All of this had to begin with the little unit. Each teacher had to do his share. Each teacher was responsible for the destiny of America because the pupils came under his influence. The teacher held the destiny of a great country in his hand as no member of any other profession could hold it. All other professions stemmed from the products of his profession. Within this great profession, I thought, lay the solution of most of the cities, counties, states, and nations' troubles. It was within the teacher's province to solve most of these things. He could put inspiration in the hearts and brains of his pupils to do greater things upon this earth. The schoolroom was the gateway to all the problems of humanity. It was the gateway to the correcting of evils. It was the gateway to inspire the nation's succeeding generations to greater and more beautiful living with each other, to happiness, to health, to brotherhood, to everything. I thought these things as I walked in the somber autumn beside this river and watched the leaves fall from the tall bankside trees to the blue swirling water. and I believed deep in my heart that I was a member of the greatest profession of mankind, even if I couldn't make as much salary shaping the destinies of 14 future citizens of America as I could if I were a blacksmith with little education at the Auckland steel mills. Nobody could keep me from starting home. I was determined to go. I needed more novels, books of short stories, books of poems, and essays for my pupils to read. I wanted to see Superintendent Larry Anderson. When Lucretia Baylor learned I was determined to go, she prepared a quick hot lunch for me. She did this while I packed my clothes and got ready. For my teaching day ended at 3:30 p.m., and I had walked the 3/4 mile to Baylor's in a hurry. It was early in the afternoon, but the dark December skies hung low over the valley, and there were 6 inches of snow on the ground. I had 17 miles ahead of me. The only way I could get to my destination was to walk. "If you were a boy of mine," Otis Baylor said, "I wouldn't let you go, not on a 17-mile journey on a night like this. I advise you against going. I know the road to Lansboro better than you do. I've walked it enough to know. It's a treacherous road when you leave the Tiber Valley Road and try the shortcut around Laurel Ridge." I knew that I wasn't listening to Otis Baylor. I was going anyway. I knew that I was fast on foot. I had walked 35 miles in a day. That hadn't even made my legs or feet sore. If I could walk this far on a short day, then I was positive as death by steady walking I could cover a mile every 12 minutes. I thought if I had luck, I could make the journey in 3.5 hours. I allowed myself 4 hours, and that was plenty of time, and I was leaving Baylor's at 4. The massive black cloud rested on the east and west walls of the valley like a roof. The east wall was the one I had to climb. When I reached the top, I would be on Laurel Ridge. By going this way, I could cut 3 miles from my walking distance. I knew the path to Laurel Ridge. I had been over it many times before. Whether the snow was broken over this path or not, I did not know. I did not care. I said goodbye to Baylor's, and I was on my way. The December wind whistled in the barren shoemake tops where the redbirds hopped from limb to limb and chirped plaintive notes. Snowbirds stood by the clumps of dead ragweed the snow hadn't covered. They were searching for a scanty supper of the frozen seeds. Though time was early on this short winter day, I thought darkness might come on soon. Going up the mountain, I made excellent time. I followed the path all right. I had to break the snow, for no one had traveled this path. I knew how to follow the path by the clumps of trees, rock cliffs, and fences. These were the landmarks to follow. When the path was covered in snow, these landmarks still looked the same. When I reached the big opening, a cleared cove where tobacco had been farmed, I knew I was halfway to Laurel Ridge, and from Baylor's to Laurel Ridge was approximately 3 miles. I looked at my watch, and it had taken me 30 minutes. This was slower time than I had expected. The snow was even deeper high on the mountain. The path was harder to break. Otis and Lucretia Baylor might have been right when they warned me against going, but I would not turn back. I was going on even if I didn't get home before midnight. I was halfway to Laurel Ridge now. I saw a rabbit hop across my path, and when he saw me, he took long hops for a sawbriar thicket. The rabbit thought night was here, for rabbits sleep on winter days and stir at night. We'll stop right there at that exciting place where Jesse's sounds like he's made a mistake. Sounds like he's made a mistake that he should have listened to the Baylors, and he should have waited instead of starting out on a snowy night and having to walk 17 miles and so late. Maybe if he'd started early in the morning where it's going to be daylight, but it's already getting dark on him, and it doesn't sound good, does it? But he was determined, like he said, he was not going to listen to nobody. He was going. He'd made his mind up. We'll just have to wait and see, though, if he regrets making his mind up to do that. I enjoyed this part. In the very beginning, he kind of answers one of the questions we were talking about last week, is the difference. What caused the difference between Lonesome Valley and the Tiber Valley there? You know, from the way the kids were dressed better, they had more, one of them drove a car, they had the horses they rode to school. You know, what was the difference there? And I guess that it might be, you know, I said maybe it was the actual land, that it was more fertile, and that's what Jesse says in this part. It was. The soil was better, so the soil allowed for them to be more prosperous. Now maybe that don't answer the question as why the people in Lonesome Valley wanted to feud and fight all the time, and these people seemed more agreeable in the Tiber Valley there at Winston, and they got along, and you know, there was the different churches, but nobody was mad at each other about it. And remember, in Lonesome Valley, those two churches that was right across from each other was always arguing and fussing, and if you went to that church, you wasn't going to heaven. If you went to that church, you wasn't going to heaven, you know, depending on which flock you were part of. So it doesn't really, doesn't answer that question, but it does answer probably why they were, the children, the pupils there, seemed so much better off, was because they lived in a more fertile place. And not just the land, but then he says that the people there too, that they used more modern farming, like they had more machinery, and maybe they just knew more about farming. Anyway, really is interesting. The main interesting part is that they were only 30 miles away from each other. You know, you think about right where you're at right now, just like I can, think about 30 miles. 30 miles from here in any direction I go is pretty much like here, you know, not that drastically different. So interesting as far as culture and habits and those kind of things. I really liked the part when he was talking about the, just because that real sense of place, because I have that here where I live, but the generational ties there to the Tiber Valley, where those families had been there for so many generations, and passed down that knowledge, even though their farms over the years they had got smaller because they'd sold part of their land, or maybe divided them between family, but still they had remained in those same general areas. And then I love that he said that the generational, they actually become tied to the cliffs and the forest and the stream, and even a large tree took on like personal, significance because those stories had been passed down. I certainly feel like that here where I live. Down the road in the first curve, even that, I even say, down at the first curve. I can remember in my lifetime when there was two big apple trees there, and that was a favorite place for all of us kids to walk down there and see if we could get any apples, little green apples. But in Pap's day, kind of at that curve, but then if you take off through the pasture, there was a mill pond. So Pap had took me there before and showed me, of course, no remnants of the mill left. But, even today, anybody in my family, in my relatives, if I said, over there at the mill pond in the pasture, they'd know exactly where I was talking about, because those things have been passed down, even though in our lifetime, none of us alive today, unless it's Uncle Henry, he'd be the only one left that would be able to remember anything about it. And it might have been gone even before Uncle Henry. He was Pap's youngest brother. Anyway, so really I love that part, just because those ties certainly exist for me here in my Wilson Holler. I love that he went back after the books and that about reading. I'm an avid reader. I've shared this before, hence I like to read, even why I'm wanting to read books to you. But I first fell in love with books. I know by the time I was in 5th grade, I was just pretty much addicted to reading. And if I didn't have something to read, in those days, if I was eating, I would eat and read. I still do that sometimes if I'm eating something, not of course with my family, if we're sitting at the dinner table or something, but if I'm eating a snack, I might be reading at the same time, and I would even read the back of the cereal box or something just for something to read. But I really fell in love with reading, and I just voraciously went through the Martins Creek School that I went to at that time. The old school's burnt down, and I was a grown woman when it burnt, but my mind immediately went to the books in the library. I just hated that they were gone. It was a little small library. Probably a lot of you have, your living room might even be as big as that library was. It was not that big at all, but I loved the books in it, and I still do that. If I find an author I like, then I go through them all. And I can remember where some of the books, the Boxcar Children, the mysteries, I still remember exactly where they were at. It didn't take me long to read all them. And then there was some historical fiction. I don't know if they were, I guess they were fiction, but biography-like books. And I still remember they were hardbacks and they were orange. The outside of them were orange. But whether it was Abraham Lincoln or Florence Nightingale or whoever it was, I read all of them. So I really loved him going and getting the books. Now, Budge Waters, again, really interesting about him is that he didn't read by sentence, he read by paragraph. He kind of, because of that photographic memory, I guess. Now, if you've read a lot in your lifetime, like Corey and Katie and Matt can't believe that I can read, how fast I can read. And I'm like, it's because I've done it so much. I've read so many books. I wish I wrote down every book I've ever read, but I never did do that. So half of them, I don't remember the names of or anything like that. But if you read a lot, you get faster and faster. But I can't read a paragraph at a time. I am a fast reader, but I can't do that. So interesting about Budge. And then, too, that he would laugh at them when they made a mistake. Now, that he laughed to that point and that he was just such an odd person, I don't really think he was... It's strange to think about. Like, I don't think he was laughing about them in a sarcastic way, like, you're a dummy and I'm so smart. It's just somehow it struck him as funny. And then he would laugh. That's what makes me think it wasn't being in a sarcastic way, because then nobody got mad at him, because he would laugh so hard that then they would just all start laughing at him. They wouldn't get mad or sold up about it. So he's an interesting character, and we'll get to hear more about him as the book goes on, I'm sure. I love the pictures that Jesse painted in this part of when he would go home with the different kids, and especially the September night with the music. Wouldn't you just like to have been there? And in September, you're so tired of the hot summer, and the air's getting cool, airish, as we'd say. Probably September night's a little airish, and sitting there with the moon and the stars and the music and the fellowship. Wouldn't that have just been beautiful? I would have liked to have been there. And I loved I would love to have experienced all that. I loved all the different recreational things he described, from the hiking in autumn. Autumn's a great time to hike. This time of the year right now, you hike. Now, if you go to a maintained trail, that's, people maintain it and there's lots of people walking on it, but the kind of hiking we like to do, you're basically just going off into the woods, and this time of the year they're overgrown and you got to watch for snakes and all that, so it's not the best time to hike right now, but autumn is the best time, and or early spring. But him describing going up on the faces of those mountains, kind of on both sides, and the valley was down between, and they could see all the beautiful colors, and especially the description of you had the oaks, the color golden oaks, then you had the pine, the green, and then you had the blue sky. Oh, don't you know, that was just stunningly beautiful. Another thing that happens in autumn, and it can happen even now if we were to get a real cool spell, any kind of little cool spell, but especially as fall begins to get here, it takes away the humidity and the smog and all that, and the sky is just startlingly blue in Appalachia. It's just amazing. Probably does the same thing where you're at too, but I always love to see that really, really deep blue sky. Another thing about all those gatherings, not so much the hiking and the hunting and all that, but he talked about the berry pick and the corn husk and the bean string and all those. Those were in days gone by, not just in Appalachia but everywhere. Those workings, as one would say, were twofold. They definitely offered the social, somewhere social to go, everybody to get together. There was always food, so that was great, and the fellowship. But they also served a purpose because you were helping each other. If you were pulling tobacco or stripping cane or stringing beans or whatever it was, you got to do it with a group, so it was fun, but it was also work. You were helping whoever's it was, you were helping them get their work done. So I really love that. We need to bring that back somehow. Of course, people today don't typically harvest in large quantities to where they need help to that degree anyway. Another thing I really loved about all the recreation that he described, and he pointed this out, was that it was multi-generational. It wasn't just the young people, it wasn't just the teenagers, it was youth, teenagers, middle-aged, old people. It was everybody all mixed up together, and that he really loved that. I love that. I think that's wonderful for our society. Doesn't happen much today in most places, unless it's within your own family, of course. But I really love that, and I think that benefits each of those, the youth can kind of see where they're headed. The middle-aged people can, look at the elders, but then offer advice to the youngsters, and it's just such a wonderful, I think that's how it's supposed to be. That was one of the things that I really loved about contra dancing when me and Corey and Katie used to go a lot. We don't go, hadn't been in a long time now, several years even. But I loved that aspect of it, is that it's multi-generational. So you might, if you're going down the hall, you're dancing your way down the line or up the line, you're going to run into somebody that could be your grandpa. You may run into somebody, like for me, that I had to lean over because it was a little boy or a girl, or a teenager. So somebody old enough to be your daddy, and then somebody just like you that's there. So I really, really love that. I liked when he was talking about the fox hunting. Now, I've never been fox hunting, and none of my family fox hunt now. In my lifetime, nobody has. But my papa Wade, he was the fox hunter. Now, not in my lifetime, but in days gone by prior to that. And that's the thing, is the camaraderie. Papa tell me so many stories about it, about just the men going and, standing around in the woods. They'd usually build a fire, and then they'd listen to the dogs. And it wasn't really about getting the fox. It was just about hearing the hounds, like Jesse describes, and then the camaraderie of being together. Pap told some really, really humorous stories that happened, because of course men was always pulling tricks on each other. And then Wid Maddox, he's the one that drives the wagon, the speed wagon that Jesse's come and went on. But how determined of a mailman is he? Because then in the winter, when he can't drive that, in the fall and the winter, probably when things harden back up. Well, no, he says he don't bring it back out till summer. So in the winter, having to do that with the horses, and having to change part way, and then having to spend the night, and then that just become a whole process. Makes you wonder if you could ask Wid what he liked best about both. I bet there's some stuff he liked best about the summer and the speed wagon, so he could hurry back and forth and get home. But there was probably parts of it he liked about the horses too. Maybe a slower pace, and getting to spend time in town. Maybe, I don't know. That's the things I was thinking about though. So that's all I had wrote down to talk about. You'll have to tell me what you thought about it, what jumped out at you about this part of what we read today. And you got to come back next week, because now we've left Jesse in a snowstorm. We've got to see what happens to him and if he makes it home.